income group related differences in activity travel behavior, then also looking at impact of built environment factors on the activity travel behavior, all in the context of non-workers. Um, Also then look at the causality among socio-demographic activity participation and travel patterns using structural equation modeling approaches. In fact, we have research papers, journal papers published on all these chapters, which are probably included in the lecture notes that you have. If you even go on my homepage and look at the journal list, all these papers are listed there, even if they are not in the lecture notes. They are all published, so you can download them and refer them in future. Now, the whole idea of doing activity based travel demand modeling, as we were discussing earlier, also comes from the fact that travel is a derived demand. Trips are done to perform some activities, which in turn would lead to which are linked by activities over time. And life is nothing but a sequence of activities undertaken at different locations. So as I said, the basic premise is that travel demand is a derived demand. It's not an absolute demand in itself. And so the travel demand models, help us better capture the reasons for trip making and portray the travel behavior. Just quick, listing of some of these definitions and terminologies that we use. One is activity, which is nothing but a continuous interaction with the physical environment, a service or person within same socio-spatial environment, which is relevant to the sample or observation unit. It also includes the pure idle times before or during the activity for the purpose of modeling. Stage is nothing but a continuous movement using one mode of transport, more precisely using one vehicle. And it also includes any pure time or pure idle time, waiting time immediately before or during that moment. A trip is a continuous sequence of stages between two activities. A trip can have only one stage, for example, a car trip, or more, as in a multimode trip. Similarly, we use a term called tour, a sequence of trips starting and ending at the same location. A trip chain is same as tour, but the only difference is it may not end at the same location. Trip purpose is defined by most important activity undertaken at one of the ends of the trip. Now, tours may be classified by length and by their most relevant activity, for example, home based tour, business based tour, and so on. So, just to give a more clear picture of what we are saying in terms of trip based or activity based approach. So, here you see a sequence of daily activity travel schedule of a worker, for example, who starts from home, goes to work, that's trip 1. From work, maybe he goes for a meeting and comes back to work, that's trip 2, trip 3. While coming back to home, starting from work, you may go to supermarket and then get back to home. Maybe at the end of the day, you go to watch a cinema. So, you start from home, watch the cinema and come back. So, there are altogether 7 trips in this, 7 independent trips. If we are using a trip based approach, you would essentially treat them as 7 independent trips. Whereas, in an activity based approach, there are 7 interdependent trips. And there are 4 activities here that the person participates. Yeah. Why he or she participates in those 4 activities? There are 3 patterns. Basically, there are 3 tours. One is in this commute pattern, other is the work based pattern, third is the post work pattern. Yeah. And then there are questions of what mode being used, what activities are done at different stops and stop locations. So that's how your daily activity travel schedule would look like for a typical worker. Again, to get a better feeling of these concepts. So you take 4 different persons with different kinds of travel. You have these purposes, or locations: home, school, factory, shopping mall, restaurant, office. So here the person starts from home, goes to school, maybe drop kids, then goes to factory. After factory, while coming back, goes to shopping mall, and then comes back to home. So what you do is you have home-based education trip, home-based business trip, home-based other purpose trip, and so on. A non-home-based other, home-based other. This person from home goes to factory, factory goes to restaurant, and then back home. Here it's a bit complex. He goes from home to factory, comes back, maybe in the evening, goes to restaurant and comes back. And here it's a bit more complex. From home you go to office, from office you go to factory, from factory you go to shopping mall, and then comes back home. So these are different patterns, different ways in which you are sequencing your activities and your travel. Now for say person C, where starts from home, goes to factory, comes back, starts from home, goes to restaurant and comes back. You have one home based work trip. This is your home based work trip, and another home based work trip getting back home. You have home based other trip and then getting back, and a trip based system, how you would see these trips. In a tour based, you have a work tour and you have a after work tour. And from a daily activity schedule perspective, it becomes like a continuous sequence. You had a leisure activity, then you travel and do a work activity, travel, do a maintenance activity, maybe at home did something, travel, have a meal activity, travel. Yeah. In some cases, you may have constrained meal is taken during certain times of the day, and so on, or maintenance is done during certain times of the day. Now, looking at these different kinds of sequences one can define different kinds of trip chain typologies. For example, a simple trip chain: home, work, home. M is any other activity other than work. Okay. Or complex to work means while going to work, you may do some other activity in between and then goes to work and gets back home. Or complex from work, you go to work from home, and then while coming back you do some other activities. Or complex to and from work, before and after work, you do some activity while the extreme ends are home. And maybe complex at work, while at work you do some activity and come back to work and so on. So likewise, one can define different possible types of trip chain typology, which are then used for categorizing and modeling the activity travel behavior. You can also think about different pattern level analysis. As I said before, work pattern, activity travel undertaken by individuals before going to work, home to work pattern, work based pattern, work to home pattern, post work pattern, and so on. Now, why do we think about, or when you compare this kind of activity based approach for travel demand versus a traditional trip based approach? The first day, the presentation that I did about mitigation policies, the travel demand model that we have used is a trip based approach or trip based model. Of course, if we have data available, we can also go and do a more rigorous activity based model. But when you compare between the two, In trip based approach, we basically focus on trips, but do not focus on the motivation of trips. In activity based approach, we consider travel as a derived demand. So, we also focus on the motivation or how they are connected to your activities or purposes. In trip based approach, it is mere collection of trips. Here it is a tour as the unit of analysis. Here you do sequencing and pattern matching, and how these are, what are the logic and why people are making such trips, but here you do not have those interrelationships being studied. In terms of time, a trip based approach typically focuses on peak period travel, okay, whereas in activity based approach you consider time as a continuous domain. You look at complete 24 hours of sequencing. Here we focus mainly on commute travel by workers and students, trips that you make on regular basis for your work or for education, which means that trips which are not made for commuting purpose are usually get neglected, are not captured, and does not get reflected in how transportation planning interventions are being done. Whereas here we take a complete day level travel activity schedule. It incorporates socio-demographic factors in limited fashion, primarily either in the trip generation equations, trip production attractions, or to some extent in the mode choice models. Whereas here, you really bring in the socio-demographic factors virtually at all levels. Here we model course level responses, by aggregating trips or trip making at zonal level, and then modeling the travel demand, but here it is more of individual level responses and individual level choices. Sometimes this can lead to inaccurate predictions, primarily because we are focusing on limited set of travel patterns, but here you can improve the prediction. Now, our case study was Bangalore. While doing this work, and there are many challenges that we see in the city, multimodal travel becoming more and more unavoidable due to multimodal systems coming in place. There are a lot of intra-household interactions in terms of how your activities are correlated to the activities of your other household members. In a trip based approach, every individual's travel, our trip making would be treated independently. We neglect or remove the interrelationship between the household members, how they pair their activities, how the activity and resource allocation is done among. For example, you may just have one vehicle in the family, one vehicle owned in the family. Now, how that being is used or shared within the household members. Likewise, those kind of things. There are also peer influences on your mode choice and other things of travel and activity. When you focus on non-workers, and when we are saying non-workers, it generally includes homemakers, retired individuals, job seekers, unemployed individuals. Yeah. Their activity travel patterns are distinctively different. They don't make commute trips. They may have lower trip chaining. So, maybe if you are doing activity travel modeling of non-workers, you need a different model structure as compared to modeling activity travel of workers. Okay. In home, out of home activity interactions are different for non-workers. and again, there is a need for different model structure. Often the activity participation is insensitive or less sensitive to travel time for non-workers as compared to workers. So, analysis of policy impacts across various population segments requires a differential modeling approach when we are focusing on non-workers. Now, if you look at literature and what has been done in terms of activity travel modeling, a lot more focus of research work so far has been on the activity travel behavior of workers. It has been studied and modeled quite extensively in different parts of the world, also in India, but a lot less work has happened on non-workers. This was one of the first studies in India where we have focused on non-workers. Now, when we look at the non-workers, there is an absence of temporal fixities and high level of mobility for non-workers. See, when you try to fit, for example, a trip chain typology for workers, it's easy to do that because your anchors are home and work in that case. Of course, in non-workers also you will have one anchor as home, but what is that other anchor is not easy to work out. So, we also researched and looked at ways in which how do you identify anchors for non-workers when you are trying to define the trip chain typologies. And they have relatively more amount of time available for allocation. The types and number of constraints are different. There may be special travel needs, especially because a lot more females and elders may be part of that non-worker section. And there have been studies, few studies at least, who have looked at how their travel and activity responds to policies and how land use and infrastructure improvements affect them. When you look at our national urban transport policy, focuses on citizen-centric planning. As it clearly says, focus on moving people rather than vehicle. But when you eliminate a large section of people within a urban setup, you are still not holistically achieving that citizen-centric planning. Okay. It also says focus on land use measures, improvements in public transport and non-motorized transport. How well they would impact or address the activity travel needs of non-workers is still unknown, because we have still not understood their activity travel patterns. Our transport planning does not account for those activities and travel while planning the transport interventions. So, there is a limited knowledge about non-workers. There has been more knowledge and more focus on commute trip based demand analysis. And it is also very interesting to see, when you look at the work participation rate, this is 2011 figures, overall average is 15% female, 45% male. So, who are the rest of the people? They are non-workers. So, that amount of non-workers are left out from your planning, and their travel needs are not considered, or activity travel needs are not considered while planning your transport interventions. You also have a lot of older individuals within this non-worker section, a large section which again gets neglected, and a lot of unemployed people also part of those non-workers. So, that motivates to carry out this research. So, these were the research objectives that we had in this work, starting with comparing the performance of some different activity travel diary formats. A typical trip based survey that is done would typically have 3 sections. One talks about the household level details, other talks about the details about each individual in the family and their commute trips, typical commute trips. So these are the things that we capture. So we looked at the efficacy of those kind of traditional diaries versus some kind of day planner diary formats with a new format to capture this 24-hour daily travel activity travel schedule in a more effective manner, so that you don't lose out any important points or data in that. After arriving at a new diary format, activity travel diary format, we then collected data. First we did a general analysis of the activity travel behavior of non-workers. Then we focused on the income group households and the differences with respect to income group households within non-workers. Non-workers in high income, non-workers in low income, non-workers in middle income. Then we also looked at the effect of built environment factors, population density and diversity, mixed land use, and all that. And then we also tried looking at the causality or relationship between social demographic factors, activity participation, and travel behavior. As I mentioned, each one of these research objectives are at least one journal paper that we have published. So you can refer to those papers in details. That's the overall approach we had. A set of primary data collection, designing the instrument, doing a pilot survey, refining it, and then doing a main survey. And a lot of secondary data that we had to use, and then use this statistical model to first understand these impacts and then feed them into understanding a simultaneous analysis of social and demographic activity and travel behavior. This was the study area, primarily the BBMP limit of Bangalore city that was used. Primary data was the 1-day activity travel survey and was done for a weekday. And the secondary data, basically the land use information was through different agencies, Bangalore Development Authority that gave us land use information, zone wise, land use pattern and land use share. KUIDFC, gave us data about road inventory and other, school enrollment and everything. Yeah, yeah. Ideally, one should do weekend also, weekday also. As I, huh? Yeah, I agree. It's just that it's a PhD work. It has to be finished in 4 years. So we just focus because your amount of effort and the cost of data, collecting data also goes high when you have to collect additional, because what we are capturing is a complete 24-hour diary of every individual and especially the non-workers in the family. So it has to be done very meticulously and it requires a lot of resources. We collected, since it was part of his PhD work without having much of funding support to do this on a large scale. So it took a lot more time with very limited resources, almost a year for him to complete this data collection, just for a 1-day diary. Because you have to have clear sampling, avoid sampling bias, representative of sample. It has to be across the city. So there are a lot of challenges in data collection. So if there are resources, one can always do it, and one should do it, of course. Capture the weekend also and weekday also. So let me come to the first part, the comparison of performance of alternative diary formats. Now there were two formats of diary that was worked out. First was this day planner format, where you have a section of activities, what did you do with whom did you do those activities, where did you do those activities, and then go on recording their travel. How did you travel, with whom did you travel, and so on. And then there is also a section which talks about if you were at transfer station, when did you arrive, the mode transfer location, parking cost, or etc. And then we had this combined diary format, combined in the sense that here you have one full section covering different stages of the travel between each individual activities, covering each stages, their start time, the stage travel, and other data about the mode transfer location, and so on. What we essentially did was doing a pilot survey, and we tried both face-to-face method of data collection and pick up and drop method. So, the idea was to compare the two diary formats as well as compare the two survey methods, and look at what is the best way to do data collection. This is a paper we have published. Sorry. It's basically, it's a random stratified sampling to ensure that the data is representative. So, we compared the sample statistics with the census statistics, primarily census statistics and statistics available from some of the agencies, BMRD, who have done comprehensive mobility plan studies. So, some statistics were available from there, population level statistics, and some from census. So, you then compare and see whether your sample is representative or not. So, those checks were done very well to ensure that it's. I will come to that, it's there. So, the pilot survey was 125 households, and as I said, we did face-to-face method, personal interview, and drop-off and pick-up method, DAP, which was self-administered. And to do this, those who participated in the face-to-face, we did a full 1 week interviewer training before they could start. So, we basically use students from low-income households to carry out these surveys and train them before that. Now, let me throw some of these findings. This is face-to-face method, diary 1 and diary 2, and these are some selected parameters per person for comparison of driving diaries. For example, average interview duration in minutes. This is what is for diary 1, a little higher for diary 2. Average number of activities captured. This is how it is for both the diaries. Okay, but when you look at the other parameters, these differences are not significant. So, both the diaries are capturing the the activity number of activities, and the duration is also similar without any significant difference. But when you look at, for example, how many average number of trips being captured, diary 2 captures a bit higher with a significant difference. Average number of stages captured are also higher. Average number of missing trips are higher in diary 1, and likewise average number of short and empty trips captured are higher in diary 2 with a significant difference. Average number of NMT access egress trips captured substantially higher in diary 2 as compared to diary 1. Mismatches out of home activity timings were higher in diary 1. Likewise, likewise, the mismatches or mistakes in recording were comparatively lesser, and was significant for recording the trip end times. We also tried looking at how the diary formats have impact, for example, in recording the average number of trips and average number of stages, and there was strong correlation of diary format on capturing these data. Then this is the drop and pickup method, except the first two, the other are significantly different. You capture better in diary 2 as compared to diary 1. Similar result as what we see in the face to face method also. And here also you see that you have a significant improvement in terms of mistakes in recording. Again, the diary format has impact on how effectively you are able to capture these data. This is percentage non-response, under different data items that we had in the two types of data collection, the face to face and drop and pickup. And you would see that the drop and pickup, the percentage non-responses, for example, on household income were higher, on age were higher. Again, monthly income, how much you spend. These are usually factors which are dicey. You will never get a complete information, especially when you do a pickup drop method. These non-responses are much higher. Now here we are comparing the two methods of data collection with respect to these different parameters. Average number of activities captured, higher in face to face method, with a significant difference. Average number of missing stages, average number of NMT trips and NMT access egress trips captured are higher in the face to face method. Here we compared the cost of collecting data as well as the response rate, and you would see this bar is for the drop and pickup method and this is for face to face interview. You are substantially cost effective doing face to face method, because in drop and pickup method your number of trips or number of times you go to household increases. There is a manpower cost, there is travel cost and all those things. Also the response rate you would see was much higher for the face to face method. So what we concluded from this part was on some aspects the diaries were comparable, especially with respect to time required for completing and recording of activities. However, the combined diary, the diary 2, is superior to the day planner format in terms of less number of missing stages and trips and fewer recording errors. We also captured the NMT trips, which are generally neglected in our transport planning and policies, are captured much better and much effectively in the diary 2 format. Both diaries are comparable in terms of design, layout and overall ease of recording. However, the combined diary, the diary 2, received higher ranks. We also did ranking from the respondents on each of the two types of diaries. The diary 2 received a higher rank on the easiness associated with filling the travel details. And the face to face method of survey administration is observed to have higher response rate and lower recording errors. So we went for face to face method and the diary 2 format for our main survey. And the main survey focused on 2,400 households, about 10,000 individuals. And as you can understand, capturing the complete 24-hour activity travel just for a day took 1 year with limited resources we had. Now let me go to the second part, where we, after collecting the after doing the main survey and collecting data, first we looked at the general analysis of activity travel behavior. This paper is published in Transportation Research Part A. It's there in the lecture notes. What we did here was to look at the descriptive analysis of the activity travel behavior, compare and contrast them with other case studies in literature, and do some statistical model of activity travel behavior. These are the household characteristics from the sample that we had. For example, motorbike ownership, one bike was 60%, If you compare, for example, in China, it's higher here in our case in Bangalore data. Likewise, uh, the car ownership, this is all non-workers. Okay, you have to keep this in mind. All these are non-workers. So uh, it's much lower car ownership. For example, if you look at Chandrabart's earlier papers, it's much higher, 87%. Uh, Bicycle ownership comparatively is higher here, lower in China, lower than in China, much higher in China. These were some contrasts that we could see and compare from literature. These are person characteristics. Uh, you have higher number of female non-workers in the sample as compared to, for example, studies in US. Um, Driving license, a lot lesser number of driving licenses holders and non-workers as compared to, for example, in US. And now this is the number of stops visited by the activity type. You have these different activity types: religious, drop off, pickup, shopping, personal or household business, recreational, eat out, medical. So these are average number of stops in a day for each of these types, and the percentage participation in these activities. So you would see shopping and personal or household business is slightly higher, followed by religious, and then pick up and drop off. If you compare, for example, with some earlier this thing, there are nearly 43% of individuals participating in recreational activities, for example, in data from San Francisco Bay. Also, the average number of pickup drop-off stops is 2.08 in this San Francisco data, much higher than what we have here. Now, this is the average duration of activities in home and out of home. You can see we have categorized in home activities as household maintenance, personal maintenance, child care, watching TV, family chat, other recreational or leisure activities in home, and out of home, religious, drop off, pickup, shopping, personal household business, recreational, eating out, medical. These are the average durations and average travel time to activity if you traveled and if you stayed at home. And you would see that those who stayed at home have a higher share of these in-home activities as compared to those who traveled. Their duration to in-home activities. Yeah, those who travel, spend also a substantial time on religious and social civic activities among non-workers. So if you compare, for example, data from these Xianmen and Tampa, they have average shopping and recreation activity durations are lower in the Bangalore case as compared to what was observed in these case studies. This is the time of day distribution of trips to different activities. How they different trip purposes and the share of activities distributed in different times of the day. You would see that a lot more activities happen during these time blocks. Again, comparing it with some data, from Xianmen and Tampa, your morning peak hour in these locations is 2 to 3 hours earlier than what we have observed here. Likewise, the evening peak hour is 3 hours earlier than what we see in Xianmen. These are good, interesting contrasts to think about and see as to how the non-workers activity travel differ. This is the modal split of non-workers from the sample that we had. Walk takes a lion share of 58%, followed by two-wheelers and almost equal share of two-wheeler, three-wheeler and buses, and lesser share of car. When we looked at some past studies, for example, again this Chandravart's paper in Dallas Fort Worth, they had almost 0% public transport trips. In Jakarta, for example, 14% share of motorized vehicle trips, and in again Dallas Fort Worth, share of car trips 55%, much higher as among non-workers, much higher as compared to what we experienced here. When we looked at the trip chain types, a lot of trips are simple trip chains, going home, from home, doing activity, come back, again going from home, doing activity and come back. So, simple kind of trip chains are much higher in non-workers comparatively, and then followed by simple in multiple tours and then complex tours. Some of the earlier references, for example, 70% were complex patterns, whereas in this study very less. So, there are a lot of contrast in terms of how non-workers travel patterns are in different parts of the world. Then we did some statistical models of these activity travel behavior. Now, this is the factors influencing performance or undertaking different activities. Okay. So, each column is actually a model, whether what is the propensity or whether you perform a shopping activity or not, likewise recreational activity or not, and how different variables of socio-demographic and other things have the impact. So, if you look at, for example, household size has an impact on some of these activities. Main thing to focus on is the sign of these coefficients, beta coefficients, and the values. So, negative signs means that increase in household size have a decreasing propensity on some of these activities, and the value of these beta coefficients suggest how strong these influences are. The number of workers and non-workers has some impact on activity allocation, especially their likelihood of carrying personal and household business activity. Homemakers, you would see, for example, the sign is positive, and the quotient values are also quite high. So, homemakers have a more likelihood or propensity of doing shopping and religious activities. Head of the household also have a positive inclination towards religious and social activities. The amount of time you are spending in watching TV in home results in low propensity to participate in out of home activity, for example, recreation. Also, mixed residential development leads to high propensity to participate in social and recreational activity, the factors being positive and strong. So, that is how you can make interpretation using the statistical model as to how they are influencing these different factors and influencing the choice of activities. These are so these are regression models. They can be linear regression models, they can be logistic regression or something of similar type. Essentially, the idea is to see the influencing effect, both the direction and intensity of influence of different parameters that we are trying to understand and how they impact the. So, here for example, the dependent variable is the choice of activity, like a binary, whether you take that activity or not. So, these are different variants of regression model. Essentially, the point that we have to keep and how do we use these results is to see their values and their direction to discern how they would have impact on those factors. So, again here we have tried to see the factors influencing the number of stops made for maintenance activity and discretionary stops, that stops made for discretionary activities, again based on a number of social demographic and travel and land use factors. And this is the share of the number of stops made 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 for maintenance and discretionary activities. Okay. So, if you have your own vehicle, again you see the sign and the value, there is likelihood of making more stops. Males tend to have fewer maintenance stop as compared to females. If there are more number of workers in the family, you would have lesser stops being met. The in-home maintenance activity duration has a negative effect on carrying out these maintenance and discretionary activities, and mixed residential areas have positive effect as you see the value and the direction on these stop making. Then this was time allocation model, where we looked at the time allocated for maintenance and discretionary activity, again how different factors influences the time allocated for these activities. So, older individuals spend less time out of home. As the age increases, you have negative influence of the age on the time that you spend on these activities, out of home activities. If there are no more workers, you spend less time out of home, because maybe workers take some share of those out of home activities for as compared to non-workers. If there are more number of household vehicles, there are more time that you spend out of home. If there are more time spent in home, there is less time spent out of home. There is also more intuitive, and the mixed land use again has a positive influence on the amount of time that you are spending on maintenance and discretionary activities. Now, here we looked at the impact of again these different factors on simple chains, simple and multiple and complex chains. You see, so many times we have used the same data to basically discern different aspects of activity travel making, and how different factors, social demographic, travel, land use factors are influencing those aspects. So, if you have mobile phone, if the non-workers own mobile phone, there is a likelihood of making more trip chains. Uncoupling of activities, simple and multiple. If there are late period travel, then there is more likelihood of complex chains, so more trip chaining. And again, if the distance of home from CBD is higher, there is again likelihood of more trip chaining of in terms of complex chains. Now, here we looked at the choice of mode. Now, this is in a different way than what we do in discrete choice model. What we are trying to see is how these again various factors are influencing influencing their choice for different modes, whether it is bus, auto rickshaw, walk or two-wheeler. So, again whether you use bus or not, that is your dependent variable, how these different factors are influencing. So, as the household income grows, there is more likelihood of using the personal modes or auto rickshaws, and less likelihood of using buses. Higher age people have less preference for walking and bus, as you can see the negative sign, as compared to two-wheelers and car. It of course decreases for all the modes. Almost all the modes are sensitive to cost. So, for non-workers, as the cost of travel increases, it would impact their choice of any mode. Mixed residential development has positive impact on using walking. Okay. And also population density also has an impact on the positive and has a positive influence on two-wheeler choice. In fact, for mixed residential area also you have a, no, where it is? Okay, yeah. So, this is a interesting actually result, that many times you may have a counter productive impact of increasing population density, or allowing high density land development, that instead of lot of trips being happening on walk for short distances, you may end up having a lot of those trips on two-wheeler, if you don't account for infrastructural improvements in those distances. Now, here we have tried to regress the time of day departure and how different factors influence the time of day departure. So, female have a tendency for using earlier periods for their different activities, especially shopping. For other activities, the preference is for later periods or even during peak periods. In-home maintenance activities, they prefer afternoon off peak period. So, if you look at how do we think about the implications of this analysis. So, there is substantial impact of time spent on TV, on watching TV, on the activity participation. We have also seen the impact of two-wheeler ownership on daily pattern, and impact of age on mode choice. So, while we have divulged into differences in the activity travel behavior of non-workers, what we also get, for example, is the influence of in-home TV watching duration, land use attributes, and time of day departure, two-wheeler ownership, and religious social activity participation on the trip chaining behavior. Also, influence of activity type and land use attributes on mode choice, and the effect of in-home activity duration on the time departure, trip departure time choice. Now, further, going further, we try to understand the household income effect. So, looking at lower income households, higher income households, middle income households, and how the non-workers in these different types of households and their activity travel behavior. This is the standard definition that we use from the census to categorize these lower, middle, and higher income. These are the socio-demographic characteristics for each of these income categories. Of course, again you will see that in other studies, for example, 55% of low income households in UK own car, whereas it's much lesser or almost zero in our case. 73% of high income households in Scotland own bicycles. So, if you look at bicycle ownership, it's much higher as what we see here in the Bangalore data. This is the stop making behavior by activity type and by income. So, what you see is lower income households have fewer shopping stops. This is the average number of shopping stops. Lower income households have more visiting stops as compared to the middle income and higher income. More recreational stops made by non-workers in higher income. Whereas, if you for example see in literature, the low income group makes more visiting stops than their, in our case, than their counterpart in US, 0.21, as what we see here in our case. This is the average duration of activities by the income class for different in-home and out-of-home activities. and you would see that, for example, household maintenance, the low income non-workers spend more time as compared to middle and higher income, more time spent on family chat. Other recreational leisure activities are more in non-workers in higher income households. Lower income households, they spend more time on the social activities, out of home social activities, and higher income group spend more time on out of home recreational activities, if we see, for example, the duration. This is the modal split again by income group. You will see that the lower income household non-workers have a higher share, much higher share of walk trips as compared to higher income. More individuals depend on foot, whereas in US it is 51% lesser than what we see here in lower income. This is the trip distance by mode in kilometers. So again, you would see that lower income household non-workers walk more as compared to the non-workers in middle income and higher income. Long distance on foot. The middle income and the higher income, yeah. So I don't know why this is 0. Yeah. So this is time of day distribution of trips to different activities. You see quite a considerable difference. For example, in this time period, you would see much lesser trips by lower income and much higher trips by higher income households. Nearly 50% of the total trips are done by higher and middle income in this time period. This again, the trip chain patterns. Simple trip chains are much higher in lower income, and complex trip chains are higher in higher income. So what we understand from this is that the lower income household non-workers depends more on foot and travel for longer distances on foot. And so, how we can use this is, localities or zones where there are households of lower income, you need to accordingly, improve the infrastructural facilities so that their travel needs are met and with more comfort and better level of service. Middle and higher income groups, there is a higher usage of two-wheelers among the non-workers. So a better enforcement or awareness is important to not allow these shorter trips to go on two-wheelers rather than walk or cycle. And lower income groups, shorter distances on taxi modes, maybe with subsidized fare, their ability to use motorized mode would increase. Now here what we have done is we have tried understanding again the impact of certain variables within the different income groups on their participation in maintenance and discretionary out of home activities. Okay. So if there are known more non-work more workers in the lower income households, you would see the positive sign. They are more out of home maintenance activities by non-workers. If the household type is detached or semi-detached, they allocate more time on discretionary activities, as you can see here. The middle income groups are more sensitive to income, and accordingly their participation in these out of home activities. In terms of the mixed residential development, the low income groups are insensitive in terms of their propensity to participate in maintenance and discretionary activities. This is again trip chaining propensity. with respect to these different modes, and you will see that the lower income group, they are more sensitive to distance to home from CBD. As the distances increases, their trip chain propensity also has a substantial impact. These are the mode choice model results. Again, and here when we looked at mode choice, the decision variable is decision to walk. And again, household, higher income households, you would see that they are more sensitive to the income, and they are also more sensitive to the distance, based on the factor, the value of the factor. So, what we conclude from this part of the work is that the daily out of home activity durations of the middle income group are highly sensitive to income and vehicle ownership. Car ownership and possession of mobile phones contribute to trip chaining when individuals move from low income to higher income category households. And income and personal vehicle ownership have significant effect on walking decisions among the middle income and high income group. Now, further we looked at the built environment factors and how they impact the trip distance and walking decisions concerning different trips. This is again the summary of the statistics, different socio-demographic with respect to different. So, in this trip distance model, what you see, for example, the age has a negative impact on the social and recreational activities. So, older individuals travel shorter distances for social and recreational activities. That is what we understand from this. Whereas household, the higher income group would travel longer distances for the social and recreational activities. If you are in mixed residential area, you would travel shorter distances for shopping. If there are school going children, you would travel shorter distances. Likewise, this is the model for walking choice. Again we looked at how these different factors would have influence on walking to shopping, recreation and personal and household business. Older individuals again are less likely to walk for shopping. Those who own vehicles are less likely to walk again. Joint travel reduces the propensity to walk if you are making the travel in the presence of others. And the mixed residential area has more positive impact on walking for these trip purposes. So, again if we look from what we gain from this study is older individuals travel short distances and less likely to walk for social and recreational trips. So, neighborhood improvements can help in improving their distances for which they can walk. Vehicle ownership, longer distances and less likelihood for walking. You have to think about measures to demote the use of private vehicles for traveling. Mixed residential areas, there is a positive influence on walking. So, that is also one of the way in which you can increase the mode share of walking. Now, the last part of this work, where after looking at these individual impacts, we then tried looking at a SEM model to see the causality and connections between the socio-demographic activity participation and travel behavior. So, this was the conceptual framework that we have, that you have this land use and socio-demographic factors, you have in-home maintenance activity, in-home discretionary, out-of-home maintenance and discretionary, and the possible directions of impact and how they impact number of trips, daily distances traveled and the daily travel time. So, we started and tried to first validate this empirical model with our understanding of, from the empirical understanding that we gained in the earlier chapters, we tried formulating how the connections would look like. For example, there is a number of trips, travel distances, travel time, and different types of activities. There is the descriptive statistics of these key variables, and how the percentage variance was accounted for in the base model for all these endogenous variables. This is the estimation result. So, in each case you would see 3 values, connecting the endogenous variables to various other types of activities and socio-demographic variables. So, the first one is the total effect, second is the direct effect, and third is the total indirect effect. So, for example, you would see that the number of trips for and connecting it to the number of vehicles. So, more trips if living in households having more vehicles, you would see all the direct, indirect and total effects, the coefficient values. Older individuals, age, connecting age to the out of home recreation, older individuals allocate less time for out of home. Again, less time out of home if more time spent in home. So, this is connecting the number of trips to the recreational tips. So, activity participation leads to more travel demand based on the increase, positive effect on the number of trips. But we find no effect of travel time on out of home activities in case of our model. Here it is the in home recreation. So, there is a trade off between the travel time and in home discretionary activity duration. So, if there is more travel time, the time allocation on in home discretionary activities is less. So, travel more distances if you are allocating more time for travel. Limited effect of mixed residential development on the travel distances. We then expanded this model further and also added the land use factors to further understand how the land use factors would then pitch in and would impact. Again, some of these observations of how the time spent would have impact on different activities. So, what we see from this work is older individuals, again we need to focus on neighborhood level measures to control vehicle ownership and the usage of motorized vehicles for shorter trips. We need to bring some enforcement and awareness. While thinking of mixed residential areas, we need to understand the secondary impacts of such policies. For example, you may reduce distances, but you must still see more trips happening on two-wheelers, which we do not want. So, if we try to summarize and conclude, we basically did the activity travel behavior analysis of non-workers, compared their activity travel behavior across income group, built environment factors, and the interplays between the socio-demographic variables, activity participation and their travel. We found that the combined format, the diary 2 and the face-to-face interview method was more effective in capturing the data and effectively and accurately. There is lower activity participation levels, dependency on walking, and lower trip chaining tendency that we observed among non-workers. With respect to income groups, low income group walk more, lower activity participation level, middle income groups are more sensitive to income. Mixed residential development has highest impact, and especially on number of trips that people make and participation in different activities. And we do see substitution effect between different activities from the SEM model that we calibrated, and there is a trade-off between how much travel time and the time spent in home discretionary activities. So that's all about this work. It was pretty comprehensive, as I said. In 1.5 hours, I have squeezed actually a work of about 6 to 7 journal papers, but it's a extremely good case study to showcase how these different sets of statistical models can be used, can be interpreted, and then you can make some policy and planning implications out of those. Any questions, or you are too tired? Yeah. Yeah, you can do in lot many different ways. I mean, there are a lot of future scope of this work. Instead of looking at each at a time, you can look at their combination, their sequencing, their interplay with each other, and so on. So there are a lot of scope to expand and extend this kind of work. No, it's not really to do with accuracy. It's more about trying to understand the impact of influencing variables, more focused using these binary approach. That's the whole idea. So, well, that this is still a matter of research. I would say trip-based modeling approaches presently are more established and standardized. Activity-based modeling is still evolving. There's much lesser research, especially done in Indian context. So, for example, if you have to use an activity travel model, demand model for a comprehensive mobility plan study or a comprehensive transport study, we still have to come to an age to understand what could be a standard framework, because if that doesn't exist, then one city may do it differently, another city may do it differently, while of course there are contextual differences, but unless you mature your modeling framework. But there are clear advantages of doing activity travel modeling. It's just that we need more research to make it or use it on a larger scale. Any other question? No. No, the idea, the way we have done the mode choice analysis was to basically understand the impact of different socio-demographic, mixed land use and other variables on their propensity to use those modes. So we have used them as binary variables, whether you would choose bus or not, whether you would choose walk or not, and how different variables are impacting that. So it's a different way of doing, but again using these statistical models. Yeah. So I mean, as you would see, there's a lot of different ways in which you look at time of day, then look at mode choice, or you look at the type of activity, and then look at mode choice. So there are various ways in which you can try to understand. As I said, there's a lot of more work needs to be done to get a better sense of non-workers' travel pattern and how that can be utilized to influence our transport policy and planning intervention, so that their travel needs and activity schedules are also taken into account when you think about a transport system. Presently, they are out of the whole scheme of planning policy and planning interventions in transport, because those trips are never captured in a trip based approach. Any other question? Good, then have a nice evening, and tomorrow again 10 a.m. sharp. Thank you.